to come together, and I pray that this will be a week where we can give thanks, not just to each other and our families, but also to you. I pray that we can use this time to reflect and to be with family and just remember all the ways you bless us. I pray that this message will be of use for your glory and will be edifying to those here. Just today I pray, amen. Okay, so we are more or less done with the main narrative of Samuel, and we are now kind of in the epilogue material, just a whole bunch of stuff that's not quite in chronological sequence. Last time we finished up the story and then talked about when the Gibeonites showed up and had their accusation against Saul. And today we're going to talk about chapter 22, which is David's Song of Thanksgiving. I did not plan this, it just happened to unfold this way. So it's a nice little surprise. Of course, this is a psalm, and it is almost identical to Psalm 18. So we have pretty much the same song twice in the Bible. Now, there are 150 psalms, right? That should sound roughly correct. Here is a nice little chart. I made this for a class. That's a whole separate thing. And you can just take my word for it that there are 150 squares here. And some psalms have are ascribed to certain people, whether they're Davidic or Korahite or Asaph, Solomon, Moses, and so on. Here we have all of the Davidic psalms. There's quite a few of them. And it is traditional to break up the Psalter into 5 collections. The first collection is Psalm 3 to 31, I believe. That sounds right. Which is entirely made up of Davidic psalms, which is why it's often referred to as the Davidic collection. And the second collection is usually called the Korahite. The third is the Asaph, and there are reasons for that, and so on. But in the Psalter, we have different kinds of psalms. And these aren't even all of them. This is just kind of the main ones. There are laments, which are the most common type of psalm in the Bible, which there might be a reason for that. In fact, there is more lament material in the Old Testament than the entirety of Paul's corpus. There might be a reason for that. There are also hymns, there are royal psalms, psalms of confidence, psalms of wisdom, and of course, psalms of thanksgiving, of which there are actually only 9. So 9 out of 150, which is also interesting. And today we're going to go through, so here we have the breakdown. The Davidic collection is Psalms 3 to 41. And in that collection, 5 of those Thanksgiving psalms are located, 18, 30, 32, 34, and 41. And 2 others are ascribed to David, that's 66 and 138. So of the 9 Thanksgiving psalms, 7 of them are by David. But today, we're going to do, 2 Samuel 22, which again is almost identical to Psalm 18. So the 2 are usually talked about and studied together, but we're going to focus on 2 Samuel. And it begins, verse 1, David spoke the words of this song to the Lord on the day the Lord rescued him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. This does not give us much in the way of historical setting. And there's a bit of debate over when exactly he wrote this. It seems like the most common time frame is that he wrote this right after the battle with the Battle of Gibeon, when Saul died. That basically means he's giving thanks that God killed Saul. I'm not entirely happy with that. I don't think it would have been written after the Bathsheba incident, so it's probably between those 2 events. I suppose it could have been written sometime around David bringing the ark into Jerusalem, but my feeling is it's probably before that as well. So it's probably sometime between him being crowned in Hebron and the ark coming to Jerusalem. there, I think, are good reasons to assume that he has already been crowned king of Israel by the time he's written this. So I would think it's probably between him getting crowned in Jerusalem, getting crowned over all of Israel, and probably before the ark coming to Jerusalem. So somewhere in that window. So roughly around chapter 5, but I think before chapter 7. So another typical thing that we do when we talk about Psalms, because this is going to be different, right? This is obviously poetic. This is not narrative. And we generally talk about poetry, talk about Psalms different than we would a more narrative section or prose section. So when we do poetry, it helps to break it down into manageable sections. And the Psalm has a fairly standard, when I say standard, flow to it. The first 6 verses are the invocation. This is pretty typical of a psalm. It is the psalmist addressing Yahweh directly, the invocation. And then in 7 to 16, we have a response. So Yahweh is going to act on David's invoking. Then 17 to 20, we have a statement of deliverance, how God has helped David. 21 to 31 is then his testimony, kind of a response to the deliverance. And then 32-46 is the thanksgiving section proper, where he's actually giving thanks to Yahweh. And then he ends with the statement of praise, which is also fairly common, to just kind of end with praise. So we will begin in verse 2 with, "The Lord is my rock." And there are 2 main issues we deal with when we're talking about a psalm. The first is going to be figures of speech, because the point of poetry is to paint a picture with words, so that in your head there are images, and then the images blur into other images, right? So there's this sort of tapestry unfolding in your mind, all through words. And there are all kinds of figures of speech. The main culprits are going to be simile, metaphor, and hypochoristicon. I'm sure that these are all just standard words you use in everyday life. Simile is any time you use an as or a like. It is primarily for comparison. So in this case, this is not a simile. He does not say the Lord is like a rock, in which case you are making a one-to-one comparison. There's the Lord, and then there's a rock, and he is somehow similar to a rock. And then you have to ask the question, how is he like a rock? The second and the most common is metaphor. The term metaphor is often misused or misunderstood to just mean any type of figure of speech. That's not true. A metaphor is a specific kind of figure of speech. Metaphor usually has the word is. In this case, we have a metaphor, which we'll come back to. But the point of the metaphor is you're not comparing. You're not saying he is like a rock. You are saying he is a rock. You are making a direct association. We'll come back to this. And then the last one is hypochoristicon. And this is, no word is used. In fact, no target word is used. It's a direct substitution. In this case, you would just say the rock. And rock is now a substitution for Lord. There's no comparison, there's no association. You have now completely removed Yahweh from the line, and you just have rock. It's the strongest type of figure of speech. And we do this all the time. For example, you may, if you watch the news, and God help you if you do, you may hear something like, "The White House said today." And if you were ever to hear that phrase, you may jump off the couch and start screaming your head off. Why on earth is the White House speaking? How on earth did the White House come to life? Are we being attacked by aliens or some sort of monstrous entity that has created this abomination where a building is now sentient? Of course not. We all know what that means. White House is a substitution for the president and his administration. So by saying the White House speaks, what we mean is the administration of the president has issued a statement. And we don't need that explained to us, we just know what it means. This is a hypochoristicon. We use one term to substitute for a much broader idea. So, probably the most famous metaphor in the Old Testament is from Psalm 23, which begins, The Lord is my shepherd. And everyone misreads this. Everyone misunderstands this because they assume it's a simile. It's not a simile. They go, well, he's like a shepherd. He is like a shepherd in that he does things that shepherds do. So the whole thing is this one big comparison. It is not a comparison. It's a metaphor. He is a shepherd. So the question that should be kind of guiding the whole psalm is, how is he a shepherd? Not how is he like a shepherd. And here we begin with a metaphor. Okay, so those are different. They're completely different images, right? One's comparison, one's association. So here we begin with a metaphor. The Lord is, which opens, kind of begins the metaphor, and then we get a string of words. It's like this weird series of terms that are all kind of building on this. I could call it an elaborate metaphor, but it's almost more of a mess. You've got rock, my fortress, my deliverer, my God, my mountain, where I seek refuge. So this brings us to the next major element of specifically Hebrew poetry. And this is quite different from how we typically associate poetry. For in English, there are a couple of things. There's meter, there's rhythm, there is the choice of words sometimes. Mainly it's rhyme, right? Roses are red, violets are blue, sugar is sweet, and so are you, right? That's how we identify poetry typically. We know that the last word of a line is going to rhyme, either with the next line, or maybe you'll skip and do like an A, B, or there's all kinds of elaborate configurations. And there are other elements, but typically it's meter and rhyme. That's how we associate poetry in English. That's not how it works in Hebrew. Specifically, they use figures of speech. Most poetry uses figures of speech. That's, I don't want to say completely universal, but fairly standard. The main thing that they do is parallels. So if we're going to talk about Hebrew poetry, we have to talk about parallels. And the idea is we have an image, and then the image is going to be expanded upon through a second line. In this case, we've got the first line, which is my rock, my fortress, and my deliverer, and then the second line is my God, my mountain, where I seek refuge. And we have to ask, first of all, what are the lines doing individually, and then how are the lines connected to each other? Again, this is through parallels. So, what are the different kinds of parallels? And in my estimation, this is from my own craziness, there are essentially three types of parallels, and it has to do with how the image is unfolding. So first of all, there are three types of movement, because the idea is you're painting a picture, and then the picture unfolds from one picture to the next. And as you go through the poem, the picture should move. It's like one of those little flip books, kids will do. You'll have a little notepad or whatever, and then on each page you draw a little figure, and then as you flip them, you have an animation, right? So each line or each couplet should contribute to the movement of the pictures. And in my opinion, there are roughly three types of movement. There is static, which means there's no movement. The picture has frozen for some reason. And this could be for a number of reasons. They're not very common, despite the fact that most commentaries will just sweep everything under the rug and say, well, it's synonymous or complementary, and the fact is they're very rare. It's very rare that it just freezes on a frame. It does happen. We'll see a few here in this psalm. Usually when commentaries do that, it's because they're being lazy and they don't actually want to think through the real reason, or they don't want to actually think through what the actual movement is. The overwhelmingly most common type of movement is just going to be simple forward motion, because that's the idea, right? You are moving from one picture to the next. So there should be a forward motion. There should never be a backwards motion. And for forward motion, it can be progressive. We'll look at some examples of that. We'll look at specifying, explanatory, expository, consequential, resultant. And as we go through, we'll see almost every one of these used. And then the last one, which I'm quite pleased with, is what I'm going to call ambivalent motion. And that's where the image is being pulled in two directions. And this could be generally for two reasons. Either because you're trying to stretch the image, so you're kind of pulling it in two directions for comparison, so the image is being pulled in two directions, or to contrast the two. So the image can go in two ways, and it's either to compare the two alternatives or to contrast the two. We'll see examples of that. Again, we'll have plenty of examples. So it begins. My rock, my fortress, and my deliverer, my God, my mountain, where I seek refuge. This seems to be fairly simple progression of thought. All right, so you begin with a rock, and a rock is just a rock. But on top of the rock, you might have a fortress. And then in the fortress, you can have deliverance, you can have safety, security. But then we shift because he's not just a rock, right? He's also a God. But then the God is associated with the mountain, and then the mountain is where you go for refuge. So there seems to be an expansion, progression of this idea from maybe simple to more elaborate. And then in verse 3, because we're going to see that he's going to do this for 2 and 3. So in verse 3, my shield, the horn of my salvation, my stronghold, my refuge, and my Savior, you save me from violence. So this is where poetry gets fun, especially Hebrew poetry, and how it gets increasingly more elaborate. So we see a similar type of construction in verse 3, where he has another string of words. My shield, the horn of my salvation, my stronghold, my refuge. You may notice that in this verse 3, these are very military type terms, right? Shield is for war, horn is for war, stronghold, something associated with war. And then finally, you got Savior and the one who saves us from violence. There is also from the verse 2 to the verse 3, you have a comparison of parallels. So you have a parallel of parallels, which you can also do in Hebrew. There is also a kind of repetition where you have an A-B type construction. So in the B of verse 2, you have my God, my mountain where I seek refuge, is paralleled to the B of verse 3, where you have my Savior and the one who saves me from violence. So there's all kinds of things you can do just with a handful of verses. Verse 4, I called to the Lord who is worthy of praise, and I was saved from my enemies. This seems to be really a transitional verse because we've done the initial invocation, right? He's described Yahweh, he's invoked Yahweh, and he's set up this sort of metaphor. We're in 2 Samuel 22. He set up this metaphor where God is a rock, and then he elaborates on that idea. He's a fortress, he's the deliverer. We have a reaffirmation, he's God, who's mountain, where I seek refuge. And then in verse 3, we have the shield, and so on. He's invoked God, he's established this metaphor about what God is, right? Because this is not a comparison, not what he is like, but rather this is who he is, right? So now we have this transitional statement where he is directly invoking Yahweh. He's set up who Yahweh is, of course we kind of know, but it's a psalm. And now he's calling out to Yahweh, which, again, seems to be more just transitional, where we've moved from the description of Yahweh with the initial metaphor into calling upon Yahweh directly. And so in verse 5, we get why he's calling on Yahweh. So we have the description of who he is, 2 to 3. Now we get the why. So verse 5, for the waves of death engulfed me, the torrents of destruction terrified me, the ropes of Sheol entangled me, the snares of death confronted me. And this should be rather simple. These seem to be rather synonymous, just sort of doubling down on the image. So you got the waves of death. This is pretty standard, especially in lament literature, lament psalms. And it's just a fairly universal metaphor, right? Your sorrows, your troubles are swirling around you. They're building, and you feel like you're drowning in your despair, right? We don't have specifically what the troubles are. We will get to the specifics, but right now it's very broad. All right, so we have, in the beginning, we have this watery sort of language, and then the next line, the torrents of destruction. So torrents, again, is still watery type language. So we have the waves of death, the torrents of destruction, and then we have the second part of the line, engulfed me, terrified me. It seems to be just a complete restatement. So we have a synonymous parallel in verse 5. In verse 6, we've got the ropes of Sheol. So it's like he's being dragged down, and I know I get yelled at from my teachers, but it's like he's being dragged to hell, right? Things are so bad, it's like he's being pulled down. They're entangling me. And then we have the snares of death, which seems to be pretty much a restatement of the next one. And you can see that between 5 and 6, we have, again, a parallels where the two are compared to each other. So the first one, we have this grim language that's very aquatic, right? It's watery language. He feels like he's drowning in his troubles. But in the second one, he feels like he's trapped, like he's been bound by death. So the two lines are virtually the same, but the picture is different. One is he's drowning like in the ocean, and the other he's bound up, tied up, and being dragged off. So, not a pleasant image. Verse 7, I called to the Lord in my distress. So, we already had the invocation, but now he set up his situation, and he is calling out to Yahweh. I called in my distress. I called to the Lord. From his temple he heard me, and my cry for help reached his ears. And you can see how this seems to be a restatement of verse 4, which earlier, right, it didn't have its own couplet because it just kind of floats there. Because its couplet is actually verse 7. So we have in 5 and 6 why he's calling out to the Lord, but on both sides we have the direct invocation. He calls out to Yahweh directly. And you can see how similar verse 4 is to verse 7, right? So in verse 4, into verse 7, we have sort of a complementary type idea where it's a restatement. And then at the second half of verse 7, we have in itself a comparative idea. From his temple he heard my voice, and my cry for help reached his ear. It's not quite a complete restatement, but the two lines are similar enough. But the point is we have the result. Right? So in verse 4, he calls out to Yahweh, and then 5 and 6, we have the reason why, because he feels like he's drowning in his despair. He feels like he's being tied up and dragged off to hell. And then in 7, we have a restatement that he's called out to Yahweh. And then at the second half of verse 7, we have the result. The result is God has heard him. All the way up there in his heavens, all the way where, even from heaven, he's able to hear David. And for the next, from verse 8 to verse 20, we basically have the consequence of being heard. So I didn't put it all here because that wouldn't fit on one screen. But we're going to have the response, right? This is Yahweh. What does it mean for Yahweh to hear David with David in this dire situation, right? David feels like he's drowning in the ocean. He feels like he's being dragged off to hell. He calls out for Yahweh. Yahweh hears him, and Yahweh is going to do something. So we get the response in verse 8. Then the earth shook and quaked. The foundations of the heavens trembled. They shook because he burned with anger. Smoke rose from his nostrils, and consuming fire came from his mouth. Coals were set ablaze by it. So here we've got another fairly elaborate setup. In the first line, this is, verse 8. The earth shook and quaked. The foundations of the heavens trembled. I'm going to suggest that this is actually a contrasting parallel because they're opposites, right? He's picturing the earth is shaking, but it's not just the earth that's shaking. The heavens themselves are shaking. So everything below, everything above, everything is shaking. And we then get this sort of transitional line. They shook because he burned with anger. So what's the they? Well, the they is the earth, the they is the heavens. Everything is shaking because he's upset. Well, then what is the extent of his anger? Well, that's going to be verse 9. Smoke rose from his nostrils, and consuming fire came from his mouth. This is a very common image for anger in the Old Testament. If you've ever seen Looney Tunes or some of the cartoons, and you get a character who's just so mad, right? Their head gets all red, and it gets all puffy, and steam's coming out of their ears, it's coming out of their nose. That's the idea. Like, God is so mad, he's just like blowing up like a Looney Tunes character. His face is getting all red, and steam's coming out of everything. And I am not exaggerating. This is a very common image in the Bible. It's like his nose flares up and steam's coming out of it. That's probably where Looney Tunes got the idea. It's just a very common line in the Old Testament. So we have here in verse 9 what's almost certainly a comparative idea. You got the smoke coming out of his nostrils, the fire coming out of his mouth, like he's so angry, fire just spewing out. And this seems to be sort of explanatory, right? So in verse 8, we have the earth is shaking, the heavens are shaking, and the reason why, or we're getting the explanation, the reason why everything is shaking is because Yahweh's mad. He is so mad, his face is like on fire, right? Smoke and steam's coming out, fire's coming out of his mouth. And ultimately, we have this final kind of floating line, which is the consequence, which is everything's bursting into flames. If you've ever played with fire, which I would never encourage you, but it's always fun, and you get coals like really hot, just really hot, and you don't even realize how hot they are because they're just like glowing, bright red, and you throw a piece of wood on and it just immediately bursts into fire because the coals are that hot. That's how angry Yahweh is. He's so angry that everything is just bursting into flames around him. Lovely image. Verse 10, he parted the heavens and came down, a dark cloud beneath his feet. He rode on a cherub and flew, soaring on the wings of the wind. So again, we're going to get the parallels. We have, it begins with, so he's, and obviously, because we could keep going on with the, from line to line, but it's not all going to fit on one screen, unfortunately. But we have the heavens, the earth are all shaking. We have the reason why, because he's angry. And now we have what he's going to do about it. So he's up there in the heavens in his throne room getting more and more angry. The earth is shaking, the heavens are quaking, and he's now coming down. He is leaving the heavens to deal with this problem that has gotten him so upset. And the first thing that happens is the heavens themselves are parting. Like the Red Sea, it's opening up so he can come down. Everything is, creation itself is aware of how angry he is. And everything's getting out of his way, including the heavens themselves, the clouds. Everything's parting so that he can come down. He's got a cloud on his feet. He's just like, I don't know, like an elevator. He's just riding this cloud platform. I don't know. I would assume this probably is just an explanatory parallel. So we have him leaving the heavens, right? He's leaving his throne room. Everything's getting out of his way. And then how does he get down? Well, he rides the cloud down, obviously. He's just on smoke. But we then get the next line, which is probably, so the next line is going to be, he rode on a cherub and flew, soaring on the wings of the wind. This is probably a specifying parallel. So he's on this cherub-like thing, and then we get the clarification that he is literally riding on the wind itself. And this seems to be a progressive idea from one to the next. So he's coming down from his throne room, he's on this cloud, but then the idea is being progressed to he's on a cherub, but he's not on a cherub, he's actually on the wind. So the image is just kind of blending from one to the next. Verse 12, he made darkness a canopy around him, a gathering of water and thick clouds. From the radiance of his presence, flaming coals were ignited. Oh boy. So we have, the heavens are shaking, the earth is quaking, or vice versa, because he's mad. So we get the reason why everything is shaking. He's angry. He is now leaving his throne room. He's riding on the cloud, the cherub, the wind, and as he is coming, right, he is approaching the area he needs to go to, and it's darkness. Darkness is coming. But it's not just darkness. It's a darkness of water and clouds. This seems to be a specifying parallel. This darkness is encroaching and coming forward. And in the darkness is water and clouds. Then we get the next line, which is radiance of presence, flaming coals were ignited. Again, this seems to be a progressive idea. So you've got the radiance, you've got the coals. So what are the radiance? It's coals, okay? And I would put this as a contrast because you have the darkness, which is being contrasted with the light. And there's a very specific image that's being conveyed here. So something dark is approaching, made up of clouds and water, and as it comes, it gets increasingly more oppressive, increasingly darker, increasingly scarier, and the darkness is growing, and then light. But not just light and fire. So we've got a cloud, a very dark, very scary, very oppressive-looking cloud. And then the darkness stops, it is broken by lightning. And then, after the lightning, the Lord thunders from heaven. The Most High projected his voice. He shot arrows and scattered them. He hurled lightning bolts and routed them. So here we have what's probably a specifying parallel. The Lord thundered from heaven. But what does that mean exactly? Well, we have a clarification, which is he's projected his voice. So it's not just thunder, it is Yahweh shouting. That's how angry he is. Then the next line is he shot arrows and scattered them. He hurled lightning bolts and routed them, which seems to also be a specifying type of parallel. Right? He's shooting arrows, but by arrows we don't actually mean arrows. Right? He's not up there with a bow and shooting darts or whatever. He's hurling lightning. And I would say that this is probably also a contrasting parallel because the storm has come. And in the storm, you've got the thunder, but you've also got the lightning. So verse 16. The depths of the sea became visible. The foundations of the world were exposed at the rebuke of the Lord, at the blast of his breath, of the breath of his nostrils. So here I would say we have another contrasting parallel. The depths of the sea were visible, and the foundations of the world were exposed. So he has come, right? He was in the heavens, it was shaking, he gets angry, he's coming down, he's come in the appearance of the storm, but he has now touched the earth. And he has touched the earth, and now everything is breaking apart. The ocean is breaking apart, the earth is breaking apart. And I would say this is contrast because we have a contrast between the sea, which is erupting, but also the earth itself is breaking up, like an earthquake. And we then have the consequence, or the reason why, this kind of reversed. The reason why the earth is breaking up is because of the next line, the Lord has rebuked. Then we have a specifying parallel. What does it mean that he's rebuked? It means he's blasted the earth with the breath of his nostrils. So he's on the earth, he's touched down, and he is so fuming mad, right, because his face is all red, he's spewing fire from his mouth, steam is coming out of his ears and his nose, and the earth itself is breaking apart because he is now on the earth. So we have a very clear progression of thought, right? In verse 12, he's come down in the appearance of this dark cloud. In verse 13, the darkness is broken because of the lightning, right? And then in 14 to 15, we have the thunder, which comes after the lightning. And then finally, he's touched down on the earth, and now everything is breaking up. The earth is breaking up, the sea is breaking up. So we can see him kind of slowly descending from the heavens down to the earth. Verse 17, he reached down from heaven and took hold of me. He pulled me out of deep waters. He rescued me from my powerful enemy and from those who hated me, for they were too strong for me. And this is why he came down. All of this, him leaving the heavens, all of this, anger, all of this pomp, all of this the storm, is so that he could save David. And we have, again, another fairly elaborate parallel. We have he reached down from heaven, took hold of me. This is a result. So he reached down, and the result of reaching down was grabbing me. And we have a clarification, right? An explanation. He had to grab me because, so explanation means there's a because somewhere. He had to pull me out of the water. Then the next line, he rescued me from the powerful enemy. We have kind of a complementary line, and those who hated me. So the powerful enemy, who are they? The ones who hate me. And then we have another explanation. So both lines have an explanatory, like why. Why did he need to do this? Well, because they were too strong. I couldn't do it myself. So the two lines are complementary, but it's not just they're complementary, right? At the beginning, back in verse 4 and 5, he had, I'm drowning and I'm tied up. So we had the water image and we have the bound image. Here we're back to the two, right? In verse 17, we have the water image. He had to pull me out of the water. He had to save me from the watery depths. And now in 18, he has to rescue me from the enemies, those who have tied me up and have left me for dead. So we have an answer to both of those previous images. Isn't poetry fun? Verse 19. They confronted me in the day of my distress, but the Lord was my support. He brought me out to a spacious place. He rescued me because he delighted in me. So we have the explanation, right, to the previous one. He had to do all this because they were too strong. And we seem to have a continuation of that idea. So they confronted me in the day of my distress. Who are the they? They're the ones who are too strong, right? We're just kind of continuing that idea. But we have the contrast, right? They're too strong. They're the ones who are molesting me. The Lord's my support, right? He's come to my aid. And then we have a second line. He brought me out to a spacious place. He rescued me because he delighted in me. So he brought me to a spacious place. Why? Because he was rescuing me because of his delight. And this seems to explain the previous one, right? He confronted them because he wanted to deliver me. So we have in verse 20, right, he brought me to a spacious place. He rescued me because of he delighted in me. And this then sets up the next section of the psalm, which is why. Why does he delight in me? Why did he go to all of this trouble to save me? Verse 21, the Lord rewarded me according to my righteousness. He repaid me according to the cleanness of my hands. This is some little iffy theology. Normally, we would hope that God would not deal to us according to our righteousness. And it's frustrating because this is at the end of the book, and we know where David's going to end up. Right? We know all the problems he's going to have, and we know all the sins he's going to commit. And this is fun. This is a fun couple of verses. So we have the Lord rewarded me. The result of this is because of my righteousness. And then we specify this. He repaid me, which, what does it mean to reward me? He repaid me. And this is according to the cleanness of my hands. So we're now going to explain what that means. What is this righteousness? What is this cleanness? So in verse 22, for I have kept the ways of the Lord and have not turned from my God to wickedness. Indeed, I have kept all his ordinances in mind and have not disregarded his statutes. I was blameless before him and kept myself from sinning. And this is fairly straightforward. I have kept the ways of the Lord, and then he specifies what that means, and that is, I have not turned away from God. The next line, indeed, I have kept all of his ordinances in mind, and we specify what that means. I have not disregarded his statutes. And then finally, I was blameless before him, which means I have not sinned. And from the first couplet to the next, we have what appears to be kind of a complementary idea. We've got the ways of the Lord, we have his ordinances, we have his statutes, right? These are all different words for the law of God. And the result of all of this is I am blameless. I am blameless, I am sinless, and therefore he delights in me and wants to save me. Yes, David is a very humble person. But we also know that Moses was the most humble man who ever lived. So what are you going to do? Verse 25, so the Lord repaid me according to my righteousness, according to my cleanliness in his sight. And this seems to be a repetition of verse 21. So in verse 21, we have the Lord rewarded me. The result was because of my righteousness. And this is pretty much synonymous with verse 25. The Lord repaid me, so reward, repaid, similar words. According to my righteousness, again. and then according to the cleanness and to my cleanness in his sight. It is not uncommon for commentaries and so forth to see this as a chiastic structure. This is just another element of Hebrew poetry. I'm not entirely sure that this is a very strong chiasm, but the basic argument is in 21. You have the Lord rewarded me, which is going to mirror verse 25, the Lord repaid me. And then you kind of work your way inward. So the parallels are not just A, B, or A, B, AA, BB, AB, AB, but something a little more elaborate. So verse 21 is going to parallel verse 25, and you can see how they work inwards. So, for I have kept the ways of the Lord is parallel to I kept myself from sinning. And then C, I have not turned from my God to wickedness is parallel to I was blameless before him. And so the kind of the focus of this section is, indeed, I have kept all of his ordinances, and I have not disregarded his statutes. So this is a fairly standard way to understand this section. And this should be a little troubling for us, I would think, because none are righteous. We don't necessarily want God saving us or not saving us because of our righteousness. And again, we know where David's going to end up, right? And depending on where we date this psalm, it does get a little dicey. Like, when exactly is David this holy? When is he this blameless? Not very many moments in his life, to be honest. So, yeah. Verse 26. With the faithful, you prove yourself faithful. With the blameless, you prove yourself blameless. With the pure, you prove yourself pure. And with the crooked, you prove yourself crooked. Oh, wait, that's not what it says. All right. So this is another element of poetry. This is a terminal deviation, which is you set up a pattern, and then at the very end, you switch the pattern as a way of emphasis, as a way of kind of subverting the audience to make a point. So in the first three, you have fairly straightforward comparisons. So with the faithful, you are faithful, right? With the blameless, you are blameless. With the pure, you are pure. And so those are all just kind of synonymous, just restatement of the same thing. And it's always fun. I'm sure you've all done this. You'll walk along and you'll see a white picket fence, for those who still know what they are. And you walk along and you just see them, and it's just a blur of white, because you're walking along and not really paying attention, and all of a sudden the white stops, and it catches your eye. So you look, and one of the panels is missing. So you didn't notice the however many panels that were there, because it was all just one blur of white. You noticed the odd one out, because our brains are just wired that way. We noticed mistakes. And there are tons of examples of this. But the mistake is usually there for emphasis. So we have this straightforward pattern. You're faithful, you're blameless, you are pure. And then we switch with the crooked, right? So we're switching the pattern, we're kind of flipping it. And obviously this is going to be a contrast, right? Because he's going to treat the crooked differently than he treats the faithful, blameless, and so on. So with the crooked, obviously he's not crooked. He's not going to be crooked. You are shrewd, right? So you treat them differently than you would others. And you certainly treat them differently than they treat others, because that's who you are, because you're God. Verse 28. You rescue an afflicted people, but your eyes are set against the proud. You humble them. This is very clever poetry. David has his moments. So you rescue an afflicted people. This is going to be line A. And this is in parallel with the next two lines. Now, the next two lines have, your eyes are set against the proud. So we have a contrast, right? With the afflicted, you rescue them. Now, the afflicted are the poor, they're the dispossessed, they're the lowly, right? So you rescue the lowly. That doesn't need a second line. That's just a standalone line. But then with the proud are the haughty. Those are the ones who exalt themselves. So you already have a contrast between the humble, who are low, and the haughty, who are proud, who are arrogant. And so you have this contrast, right, between how you treat the low and how you treat the proud. And so you set your eyes on the proud, and you humble them. So you save the lowly, and for those who are proud, you knock them off their pedestal, which is you bring them down, right? Verse 29, Lord, you are my lamp. The Lord illuminates my darkness. So this is, this is a really interesting little image, right? You are my lamp. We have another metaphor. And then we have the sort of the extent of that, right? What are you, or how are you functioning as a lamp? Well, you illuminate the darkness. Well, what does that mean exactly? Because we're building on an image. God is not obviously a lamp, right? It's a metaphor. And yet, he illuminates the darkness. So what's the darkness here? Well, the darkness, because it's poetry, it's whatever horrible situation he's in. So the lamp, right, illuminates the darkness, meaning it gets rid of it. So you get rid of whatever the problem is. So just as we've gone through all of this, right, he had the drowning metaphor, he had the being bound up metaphor, he has God coming down like a storm to save him, he pulls him out of the water, he frees him from the people who want to make him captive, and now he has this sort of all-encompassing image of you're like a lamp. I say like, that's wrong. You are a lamp who drives away the darkness, and the darkness being just whatever horrible thing happens to me. So verse 30. With you I can attack a barrier, and with my God I can leap over a wall. So this is a fairly stark shift. We just had this lamp metaphor, and we would assume we would build on that, but he just immediately shifts to this barrier idea, which is very warlike, right? There's some sort of obstacle, and because of you I can attack the obstacle, and not just attack it, I can just leap over it, right? I can confront it or get around it. Verse 31, God, his way is perfect. The word of the Lord is pure. He is a shield to all who take refuge in him. For who is God beside the Lord, and who is a rock only our God? God is my strong refuge. He makes my way perfect. And this seems to be just simply enough of another chiasm. You can see here in line A, and I would argue that this is a much stronger chiasm than what we had before. We have line A, God, his way is perfect. This is paralleled to 31. He makes my way perfect. It's a nice parallel. And then in B, he is a shield to all who take refuge. And then in B, he is my shield, right? So then we have C. For who is God besides the Lord, and who is a rock only our God? So that's a nice little construction. Verse 34, he makes my feet like the feet of a deer and sets me securely on the heights. He trains my hands for war. My arms can bend a bow of bronze. You have given me the shield of your salvation. Your help exalts me. You widen a place beneath me for my steps, and my ankles do not give way. This seems to be a series of, I'll say metaphors, but these are mostly military-type language. So you make my feet like the feet of a deer, so I can run and fight and do all the things I need to do. And the result of that is because of that, I can securely move around, I can get on the heights, I can escape danger, I can run away, I can attack, and so on. And then the next one is, he trains me for war. The result of that is I can bend a bow, I can fight. The next line, you have given me a shield of your salvation. The result is you help me, particularly in battle or conflict, whatever I need. And then finally, you widen a place for my steps. And you can see, and all of these are just kind of complementary, just different ways of expressing the way you've helped me and the way you have aided me. Again, most of this seems to be very military-type imagery. But you have another somewhat of a chiasm. So in A, he talks about how you've given me feet like a deer, so I can run around and leap and so on. And then in the what should be A prime, you prepare my path, right? You make the way for me so that I can go and do what I need to do. And then in B, you have trained me for war, but also you're the one who shields me. You're the one who protects me. So verse 38, I pursue my enemies and destroy them. I do not turn back until they are wiped out. I wipe them out and crush them. They do not rise. They fall beneath my feet. We have what at first seems to be just a complementary parallel. I pursue my enemies, and then they do not turn back. This, you can see, is complementary to the next line, which is, I wipe them out, and they do not rise. This seems to be a progression of thought. I wipe them out, I crush them, and they do not get up, right? I destroy them to the point where they are unable to get up again. And then the result of all of this is they just fall. They fall beneath my feet. Verse 40, you have clothed me with strength for battle. You subdue my adversaries beneath me. This seems to be just, he's giving, after all this build-up and back and forth, it is Yahweh, ultimately, who prepares him for battle, right? Yahweh is the one who arms him. Yahweh is the one who clothes him. Yahweh is the one who equips him for battle. But then, it's not just that Yahweh equips him for, like I would say this is the verse where he gives Yahweh the most credit, right? You are the one who equips me, but then you're also the one who fights for me. So not only am I equipped, but when I go out, you've already taken care of everything. So verse 41, you have made my enemies retreat before me. I annihilate those who hate me. They look, but there is no one to save them. They look to the Lord, but he does not answer them. I pulverize them like dust of the earth. I crush them and trample them like mud in the streets. And this is a fairly elaborate series. So in the first line, which kind of sets everything up, you have made my enemies retreat. I annihilate those who help me. And all I can picture is this sort of, I set them up and you knock them down, right? We're a two-man team, right? You do your thing and then I help out. So you make them retreat and then I go in and I clean everything up. So we have what you do and then you have what I do. So we have the initial line, which I see as a contrast, the contrast being there's what you do and then there's what I do. So then the next verse, which you can see is the blue, is a clarification, we could say, or an explanation of what that means. What does Yahweh do? Well, because of what he does, they look and there's no one to save them, right? Because Yahweh's taken the initiative. And then they look to Yahweh, but he's not going to save them because he's not their God, right? He's on David's side. He's helping David. And then the next line is the clarification of, or the explanation of what David means when he goes, I annihilate them. By annihilate, I mean, just so that there is no confusion, I pulverize them like dust. I crush them and trample them in the mud. So, just in case you were unsure of what he meant. Verse 44, you have freed me from the feuds among my people. You have appointed me the head of nations. A people I had not known serve me. Foreigners submit to me grudgingly. As soon as they hear, they obey me. Foreigners lose heart and come trembling from their fortifications. Again, we have a fairly elaborate series. So we begin, you freed me from the feuds of my people. You appointed me the head of nations. I would suggest that this might be a contrast in that you have cleared everything up among my own kin, which to me strongly suggests that he's ruling over Israel at this point. Because it's not just that he's ruling in Judah, but everything is paved, the road is open up for him now to take the throne of Israel. And it's because Yahweh. Yahweh has cleared all the feuds, there's no more grudges, everyone's okay with him being king. But it doesn't stop there. So he's king now of his own people, his own kin, Judah and Israel. But he is now also king of other nations. So other nations are now paying homage to David or are getting out of his way. So his own people serve him, but also other people are serving him. Get the contrast. And then we have this transition, a people I had not known serve me. This is probably referring to the second line, right? The nations are now serving him. So we're going to get an explanation of what that means. So we have foreigners submit to me grudgingly. As soon as they hear, they obey. And then we have an almost synonymous line. Foreigners lose heart. They they come trembling from their fortifications. Verse 47. The Lord lives, may my rock be praised. God, the rock of my salvation, is exalted. And this seems to be, in a way, kind of the initial conclusion to the psalm, which is a repetition, or a very close repetition back to verse 2, how the psalm began. So we had the Lord is my rock and my fortress, and my deliverer, my God, my mountain where I seek refuge. And now we have a parallel to the 2-3 line, which is the Lord lives, may my rock be praised. So the result of We begin with this initial metaphor, he's a rock, and we go through this entire psalm explaining what his role is as rock, right? All the things God has done, all the ways God has helped him to earn this title of rock. And so his conclusion, almost, the result of all of this is, the Lord lives, may the rock be praised, right? Because we're back to the rock metaphor. The whole thing was one big elaborate metaphor. And then he follows this up, God, the rock of my salvation, is exalted. And this then brings us to the praise, right? He's now going to praise Yahweh. So the psalm is kind of formally over, and now we conclude with this praise section. So verse 48, God who gives me vengeance and casts down peoples under me, he frees me from my enemies, you exalt me above my adversaries, you rescue me from violent men. And again, we have a somewhat elaborate parallel. So he begins with God who gives me vengeance, that's kind of the initial line. And then this is going to be in contrast to what happens to the people that have oppressed him, right? So God saves him, and then we have why he needs the saving, right? Why he needs the vengeance. So he goes, he casts down people under me, and this is all sort of explanatory. He frees me from my enemies, you exalt me from my adversaries, you rescue me from violent men. And we have basically a A-B kind of structure. So with the first line, you have you cast down people under me, which seems to be paralleled to you exalt me above my adversaries. Again, we already saw this in the psalm. So you cast them down, and you exalt me. Right, so they're knocked down, I'm lifted up. And then the next one is, he frees me, so you got the red one, which is the contrast, and then the blue one. He frees me from my enemies, which is parallel to that last line, you rescued me from violent men. Verse 50, we are almost done. Therefore, I will praise you, Lord, among the nations. I will sing about your name. He is a tower of salvation for his king. He shows loyalty to his anointed, to David and his descendants forever. And this is somewhat straightforward. He begins, therefore, I will praise you, Lord. And this seems to be complemented with, I will sing about your name. So I will praise you, and then this is complemented with the idea of singing. Praising, singing are fairly similar. They're not exactly the same, but close enough. Then we get the what I'm going to call expository, which is, as far as I can tell, a pretty somewhat rare category, but I think it's legitimate, in that we have, I'm going to praise your name, I'm going to sing about you, and now we have the content. What are you going to sing? What are you going to include in your praise? And that's what we get. We get the exposition. He is a tower of salvation for his king. He shows loyalty to his anointed. And this is the exposition for the songs and the praises. And then finally, we get what I would say is perhaps a specifying parallel, which is who exactly does he mean when he refers to the king and the anointed, right? We have the king, we have the anointed, they're both in parallel, but now we get the identification. He's talking, of course, about himself, because, of course, David's talking about himself. But not just himself, also to his descendants, which should include his own son eventually, which will be Solomon, but then those who are included in the covenant, so the future kings and Messiah. And with that, we'll conclude for tonight.
David was a very humble man. So sometime tomorrow, Wilda's daughter will make arrangements, and as soon as she does and lets me know what they are, I'll post them out there or let y'all know, text you. But right now, we just don't know much of anything about what they're going to do. But I do think that she intends to have the service here, which I told her the church would be open, available for that. But we'll see. I'll let y'all know tomorrow. Keep Amy in your prayers. I'm sure it's going to be a difficult day for her tomorrow as she makes these plans. So let's go, Lord, in prayer. Father God, thank you for today. Thank you for this morning. Thank you for every gift, every blessing you've given us. Thank you for gifting those who teach the word to us, Father. And Lord, I pray you'll continue to be with James, Lord. And thank you for the exposition of your word tonight. And help us to take these things to heart. that you are our God and that you are on our side, and you do defend us, Father, from enemies seen and unseen. We thank you for that. Now go with us. Bless our week. In Jesus' name we pray.